Hello everyone, and welcome to this, the first Open News meeting of the year. But it says something about the amount of news and our appetite for it, that we are about 36 hours into the first working week of the year, and this is our third thinking. Last night, if you joined us, we were making rash, or I was making rash predictions, and this morning we were talking about the question of simplicity of message versus complexity of detail around vaccines and communications. Today over lunch, what I wanted to do was do what we would do were we back in our newsroom, and it now appears that for a good while, maybe in some ways forever from here on in, our newsroom is going to always be a somewhat digital thing. But I wanted to do what we would do normally on our Tuesday meeting, which is just sort of clock a few things that are on our minds editorially in terms of the way we approach stories. And then I'm just going to check in with a few people on some of the sort of question marks that I've got around stories, if you like, a few pieces of the low-hanging fruit. And as ever, the aim of this open news session is really to invite everyone to weigh in with subjects they think we should be covering, angles they think we should be covering, disputes they've got with the way in which we are covering some of the stories so far. My colleague Ella Hill is going to try and corral the conversation in the chat, so please do weigh in. I suppose I just wanted to say at the top, you know, one is the really big change that we made in certainly the second half of last year was really driving towards more audio storytelling. More of our podcasts, Basher Cummings, you know, leads the slow newscast. In the process of doing that, what we found is we really were forced to distill away from a subject area into a story, that it's much more narrative, and when it really works, that's exceptional. And so I think that we're going to push that more than ever in 2021, really focus on finding the subject we were interested in and then finding the story that tells that subject. And the story, by which I mean, you know, beginning, middle and end, a person, a story that you can tell. Did you see that story about so-and-so? So that was one thing that's on my mind. The other is, what we found more and more is that we are really discovering there's an appetite for what I think of as tortoise opinion. Not the opinions just of us as kind of members of the Tortoise newsroom, but opinion that is kind of rooted in considered analysis of what's happening, but has a muscular point of view. And I suppose that what Merrippy Mills and Giles Wattell and Chris Newell and the whole gang did at the end of last year around the COVID inquiry was a really fact-based piece of opinion. And I hope we're going to do more of that, and you'll see more of that too. And then finally, one other thing is, I just come back to this idea that journalism, when I started out, was about data that illustrated stories. Now I think it informs them. Now I think we start with the numbers. And I think, like lots of people, when we're trying to understand what's going on, we're going to the ONS Excel spreadsheets on COVID. And I think that, and on a whole other bunch of subjects, we really need to be data driven and think about the visualization of it, the storytelling through data, you know, the primary sources that we've used before. I mention that just as you're thinking about story ideas and how we're going to weigh in. But I might, if it's all right, so I'm only pausing because there's lots of interesting things being said in the chat already. So I'm going to bring you in on those in a moment. But you know what I'm going to do? There are a few subjects that I wanted to touch on just to go around the newsroom and just get a sense of what we think is going on. If you saw the Sense Maker this morning, you'll see that my colleague Chris Cook left us with something of a cliffhanger, which is to say, look, it was clearly the case the government was going to have to close schools. The announcement that was rather woven into the PM statement last night was around exams. It's unclear what Gavin Williamson and Ofqual do next, but I wonder what Chris Cook, if you're there, you think his options are, and what option you think he should choose.
Sure. So I think they're right to cancel exams, which is an annoying thing for lots of teachers and parents. But the but the you'd have a series of problems with trying to run exams at the end of this year. The most important one of which is that if you get the idea of a credential, the central idea of a credential in education is that if you get an A level this year, it's roughly the same. We know what that is. It has a set of values embedded in it. So you know that a kid who's got an A this year is probably going to be better at that subject than a kid who's got a B, right? Probably. There's a lot of error in the marking. And we know that kids who tend to do better in, say, maths at A level will tend to get better degree level results than a kid who's got a lower grade in maths. And the problem the government had was fundamentally that the pandemic has disrupted schooling so much that those relationships would probably not hold. And so a university or a future employer can't rely on this thing called an A level in the way they previously should. And fundamentally, the idea, I had to go back to the central idea of a credential. A credential tells you is supposed to be comparable. A credential where you can't compare the results is completely pointless. It's just a waste of everyone's time. It's actually dangerous to run a high stakes exam series during a pandemic. You want teachers who are feeling unwell to not come to school. You want kids who are not feeling well to be relaxed about pulling back and not going in so they don't spread the disease. And having a high stakes exam series during a pandemic obviously creates incentives for them not to do that. So I think there was no choice but it didn't make sense to hold a high stakes exam this year. The central thing they've got to get across and get into their heads, and from talking to a few people today and yesterday, I think officials have clocked this, is that whatever we do now, it can't pretend to be a normal GCSE or a normal A level.
Right.
So whatever it is, whatever qualification you get, it shouldn't seek to mimic a normal A level. It shouldn't be a thing that looks on your CV like you've sat A levels like in previous years. And that might sound horrific if you're contemplating it yourself, but actually it's easier to understand as an employer. I got like a pandemic GCSE and it's not got a normal grade. It's pass merit, whatever. It's got some other weird grading system, because we know what that is. We all remember the pandemic in years to come. Than it is to have kids who say, well, I only got a D in maths, but actually it's a pandemic D, because we'll all be like, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, people won't believe that. It's easier to have a new. The other thing is if you give up on the idea that you're going to give, A star, A, B, C, D, E, whatever, you can choose marking criteria that teachers can more easily assess without, a lower, coarser grain, right? So you can say, we're going to give kids who are, who we think are roughly in the top third of the distribution, who are really good at, talking in class, who are really good at essay writing. We think they're roughly in the top third of the kids I've ever taught. So I'm going to give them roughly the top grade. That's a thing we can do, rather than trying to say, do they meet the following very precise criteria, and trying to line these criteria up. If you give a new set of grades that don't have a sort of set of expectations attached, you can sort of embed that idea of uncertainty in the new system.
And Chris, just two questions. One is, how much do we think that people who have had their education interrupted in their GCSEs or in their A-level years, i.e. from March of 2020 now all the way through to what looks like it will be released to the summer of 2021, take A-level students, that is the majority of your course time. How much do we think people have learned less than they would have done? I forget the exam question, actually the education question.
So the first people even before me, the first person to call for exams to be dropped this year was Chris Husbands, who's the Vice Chancellor at Sheffield Hallam, and he's significantly the head of the Teaching Excellence Framework, which is the government's bureaucracy for checking university teaching. He's a person who believes deeply in the university's capacity and role as didactic institutions, not just research institutions. And the reason why Chris wanted to abolish exams was because he basically said, well, you can get another term of teaching in if we abolish exams, because we think this is the big problem. It would be better to have a cohort of kids whose grades are a bit fuzzy and weird, but who know more than it would be to have precise rankings. There are 2 bits of research I've seen. There's actually 3 bits of important research I've seen. One is from a company called No More Marking, who do comparative testing, and they reckon basically they're a sort of marking company. They're a bit complicated, but they have a good assessment framework. And they reckon that kids at age about 11ish had lost 22 months of learning over the summer. So the spell that from
What do you mean? So that doesn't make sense. How can you do 22 months of learning in less than a year?
Well, quite. But if you think of it, that the kids forget things all the time, and they're sort of you're running on the teachers are running on.
Oh, I see.
Going backwards on an escalator that's going in the other direction, and so actually, if you stop, you will go back naturally. So you can spring back more than a month. So what I mean by 22 months is that kids at the beginning of this academic year were testing at the same levels they had been testing at 22 months ago. They're getting the same marks as before. So the good news is that everyone else's research is finding much smaller losses. It's in the months. It's like it's significant, but people. The other thing is kids are quite resilient. The other thing is I sort of feel the world is more sort of homeostatic than people give it credit for, right? So if you get a cohort,
what does that mean?
Like it self balances, right? So if you get a world where 700,000 children emerge into it, and they're not quite up to it at A levels, it's not going to be that we're going to see this ripple for the rest of our lives of this sort of these people's inadequacies carried through forever. Like they'll pick up stuff, they'll learn, the world will slightly adapt. You know, I think we can overestimate the importance of sort of trying to smooth this stuff out.
And what about, and Chris, what about, so I had one of those howling at Gavin Williamson moments before even the last 72 hours, which I think a lot of people have had those moments in the last 72 hours, which was just before Christmas when the announcement was made on the change in terms around the exams, i.e. we're going to give you the exam questions so that if you've been to school or if you haven't been to school, the odds are theoretically more, are lessened. There's a balancing act there. Apart from that being preposterous, the thing that was really revealing about it, to me at least, was we got to the point where we were so prizing exam results that we would give you the questions so you could bone up on the answers at the expense of time spent on your education. And it felt as though we'd revealed what our schooling system had become, which was kind of the exam factory problem. And I wonder whether you think this is going to really force a rethink on that.
So I think there are 2 things. So I think first of all, it made their decisions made sense, right? In terms of if we want an assessment of how good kids' sort of underlying aptitudes are. So we don't care if you know about the French Revolution, really, when we do a history A level. What we care about is, are you the kind of person who in 3 years' time will be getting good A level history degree results, right? We don't really care about what you know. So this is a difficult thing for lots of teachers to because it's the opposite of how they think about exams. But we fundamentally only care about exam results because they're predictive. And actually, if you have what they were doing they were sort of going to go to open book exams, they were going to have more clarity about what would be in the exams, and they would have much less content in them. The idea was to make it a sort of purer test of that aptitude, in the hope that if you could basically tell everyone, you know what, we're only going to do 1 paper, you would hope that it would be a sort of fairer fight between kids who had lost. You'd be a bit easier to pick out who was genuinely really good at the subject and who wasn't, because there would be less capriciousness. It would be less reliant on who had completed what. So I sort of feel like that was a sort of a meaningful thing. I think I would be really nervous about trying to retool education on the basis of our experience in the pandemic, because we shouldn't run the world as though we're about to be continually plunged into pandemic. Right. And I also think one of the difficulties actually has been persuading people who are sort of on the traditionalist side of the fence that we actually need to take emergency measures. They've all been terrified that this will be the thin end of a wedge, and that if we have a year without exams, oh my God, the exams will never come back. And actually, what we need it would be quite helpful if everyone could sort of agree, we're just going to get through this and we'll go back, and then we can have a conversation afterwards, having reflected on it a bit. Because actually a lot of people have been terrified of taking necessary measures for fear of there being this being the beginning of the end for them.
Listen, I just want to pick up on a couple of people who made points, Chris, as you were talking. Sudi Piggott made a point. Daniel Dipper, who, if you look at the backdrop, is definitely in education. So it's an absolute wall of files and school books. And Luke, our colleague, Benham, who we plucked from Higher Things, who was doing a fair bit of teaching himself. Sudi, why don't you kick off, then I'm going to go to Daniel and then Luke.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I think that, as well, someone who always hated exams, I just think to go back to actually interviewing people. I mean, I know it's very time consuming. I mean, this is talking about university level. I don't know that it would apply further down, but, doing things more orally and looking for potential, because, that surely the potential and the interest and enthusiasm and, that ability to learn, or the openness to learning, surely that's the sort of intelligence, that we need now to kind of survive in any kind of life. And I just think we need to change this whole exam situation. I mean, I know when I went to university, we were, I had interviews at every university, at 5 different universities, so it was time to do it then. I mean, I'm not that old.
Trudy, thank you. No, I agree. But I do think that Chris's point, which is when you have less time with kids in schools with their teachers, part of that, I understand the position of teachers, which is it's harder to make those judgments. I'm going to come back to Chris in a second, but Daniel, why don't you? I saw your attainment point and the Sutton Trust piece you linked to. Do you want to touch on that, and then Luke, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I was involved with the exam things last year, of course, because it impacted me directly. But in regards to the Sutton Trust thing, so I wrote a piece on their reflection on their APPG on social mobility last July. And as part of that, I detailed some of the attainment. So the attainment gap was already quite wide before we even got into the pandemic. The most recent data, at least when I wrote that piece, was from 2019. And at that point, I think the figure that I quote in the article is that by age 16, the most socioeconomically disadvantaged students would be 24 months of learning behind their most advantaged peers. And that was before COVID. So no doubt that gap has much widened. So there was already a problem. I mean, the attainment gap apparently had been narrowing for the last few years, but it actually stalled in 2019. That was the same figure in 2018. So we already had an attainment gap problem before we even got into the pandemic. So no doubt that will get a lot worse.
And Daniel, can I just ask you one thing? Having being on the other end of this circus personally, if you were Gavin Williamson, I think probably quite a lot of people on the call would be quite happy if you were Gavin Williamson instead. But if you were, Daniel, what would you actually do? Because let's say you take Chris's idea that you're going to have a 2021 qualification, a special GCSE or A-level. Do you think that's the right thing? But what would you actually suggest is done so that kids come out of the school at the end of this year with something?
So I mean, when I wrote a blog last year about this in about June, because I was quite concerned about the system, I suggested some form of assessment where you provided like a palette of evidence. So some mock exams the student has completed with the teacher's feedback on, some coursework, if they've been able to do that, their classwork. So kind of like a sample of work, and then exam boards would, I mean, they don't have the resources to look at all of it. So what mostly happen is it end up being sampling of, they'd sample particular, randomly within a school or only picking particular schools or whatever. And they'd look at the evidence there. Because the issue last year was it wasn't actually evidence-based, in the sense that the teachers made their predictions based on evidence. And that was what they believed the students would get. But if you want to do standardization things, there will still be an element of teachers using their judgment, which is exactly what they should be doing. But you can't standardize just a bunch of letters if you don't have that extra information, because they're basically standardizing them on what school they went to, which shouldn't be a predictor of performance, particularly if schools are improving or particularly hardworking students. So evidence-based approach is what I'd suggest. In regards to having a different qualification like what Chris was outlining, I can see the merit in doing that, because you're saying, look, we're not even going to pretend these are comparable. Because I think that's part of the concern about standardization. It's because they were using the same system as such in terms of the letters produced. So they wanted to try and standardize it, because if they kind of change the back workings and it isn't comparable. But I think the problem that I kind of would think of, and I'm not sure I've got an answer to it, is when they introduced the 9-to-1 system for GCSEs, employers were incredibly confused about it, from what I heard. And actually, it took quite a while for them to understand. And they was trying to compare that to, okay, what does that compare to an A-star? And they was getting, I did hear, you know, anecdotally, employers were getting it the wrong way around and thinking students who got a grade 9 had basically got a grade 1 and vice versa. And it was really, really confusing.
Disclosure, when you're talking about employers who seem to be so old they don't understand the new exam system, you're talking about people like me, because I'm one of those people who thinks, hang on a second, what does that correspond to? And that is the risk with Chris's system, which is you have another wrinkle that people then don't understand. So I appreciate that. Daniel, by the way, I have to just say that Andrew Girdwood is taking a lot of interest, no doubt, in what you're saying, but also the collection of games behind you. So there's going to be at some point a thinking on pastimes, hobbies, and games for this next stretch from here to April. You're going to have to come to help us through it. But I'm going to go to Luke, if I might. Luke, what do you think on this? I mean, I've got to say, I'm instinctively with Daniel on the let's have something that's assessment, let's have something that's regular, let's have less kind of pressure cooker at the end of the year. But
yeah, well, there's been a lot of sort of will behind that movement for a while. The issue being, and that phrase you used, Daniel, the sort of palette of evidence sounds excellent, but that type of holistic approach, like we were noting, it's the will is there, but the resources, and I think also the sort of native technological ability in government or in schools is not there in order to make it comparable. So whilst it sounds nice, a holistic approach sounds attractive, I think it would be problematic bringing it into action. Just peeling back a bit to what Chris was saying about sort of comparability over the years, of course, it's a problem that needs to be solved at the end of the bottleneck, where we use exam qualifications to apportion opportunity in society. So what Sudi was saying, and people in the chat mentioning university interviews, job interviews, all those things, we use them in a sort of an eliminative way. And if they're not comparable, I think that the risk of introducing things like secondary palette of evidence-based assessments, whilst they sound good, will be highly gameable. And there's already a huge industry in the UK around tutoring, educational consultancy, educational mentorship. And if organizations, universities, schools, whatever it may be, come up with supplementary systems for assessing candidates because they've given up on the comparability of the exam results coming out of the public system, those things will be subject to lots of abuse, would be my suspicion, and that abuse will widen the already completely awful inequality of education gap that we have in the UK between students from different households.
So I think, look, there are lots and lots of people who are talking. I saw that John Alexander had pointed us to the kind of Peter Hyman work on this, and we had Peter, didn't we, at the Education Summit a few months back. Yeah. It feels to me as though this is just a really big subject for us that we should get into. And I sort of take Chris's point. There's a here and now set of questions, and there's this longer
yeah.
term. I'm gonna do something that's slightly artificial, which is stop a really good conversation, just so we can touch on some of the others that we wanted that were on our news list. And Luke, while I've got you, I just wanted to talk to you about Tokyo and the Olympics. So the reason for this is I am sort of quietly a little proud of my suggestion in February, the middle of February last year, that they were going to have to postpone the Olympics 2020 from Tokyo.
Yeah.
Now I'm sort of thinking, well, they're going to have to do it in 2021 in some form or other, aren't they? But I don't know, and I sort of feel like we would normally be going into an Olympics year getting quite G'd up about this, but it sort of disappeared from view. So I asked you just to have a look. What do you think is the likely prospects for Tokyo this year?
I think it's highly likely it goes ahead. The main reason being that there's now a consensus between the new Japanese premier and the president of the Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach. That's basically, he said earlier in the year, if it doesn't happen this year, it cannot happen for reasons of consistency around sort of athlete welfare, the infrastructure you have to keep together to have an Olympics. Like, you can't keep rolling it back, essentially. So I'm very confident it'll go ahead. I'm very confident it will go ahead in July. The big question now turns to what I was sort of picking up as the 3 S's of this Olympics, which is safe, secure, which are the 2 sort of formal ones they're going for. But there's also this third one of successful. And I think if you were speaking to organizers in Japan, they're highly concerned with the success of this Olympics, because obviously there are going to be limitations on spectatorship. There are going to be people who are sort of deriding it, saying we shouldn't have brought it ahead. It's hundreds of people from all over the world pooling together in one place. It seems, with the conversation going on about new variants, and so it seems like a bad idea. And the track record of testing, I know it's not for infectious disease, but testing in the Olympics is not excellent. So I think the question now turns to what guidelines do the organizers and the OAC agree on to keep those first 2 S's, the safe and secure. They haven't said anything yet, but they have said that they will cut back to the essentials of the Olympics. So we'll have to wait to find out what that really means.
So what does that mean in terms of spectators?
I personally think it will look, and this is just from reading that it's only speculation at the moment, but it will look something like the NBA bubble did, in that there will be closely screened, televised things, and then there'll be spectators who will be like beamed in. So you'll be able to watch from inside the stadium, but remotely. And I think it's quite likely that there will obviously have to be long-term sort of planning as to how you test the athletes and support staff. But people watching the 100-meter final with their eyeballs, I'm not sure.
Right. Well, our colleague Tess Murray is worried about Love Island going ahead, and I know we share her concern about that, and we're all thinking a lot about it, and we're rooting for the winners. Well, thank you. I'm going to just. I wanted to loop back to the UK, to some of the issues about the Johnson announcement last night, to some of the pieces we've had over the last couple of days. But the thing that's really striking is that I think that if we were doing this in French and we were talking about the vaccine rollout program in France, you know, we wouldn't be able to speak for the kind of sense of bewilderment and fury. It seems to be, you know, unfeasibly slow. And I just asked Ellen whether you just give us a quick readout on what you think's happening there, whether it's happening later because it started a bit later, or whether there's truth to this idea that there's something in the process that is making it more difficult to reach people. Ellen, are you there? There you are, far away.
Yes, hi. Yeah, so as you said, it's not going super well in France in terms of the vaccine rollout. So, you know, we talked at the beginning about the importance of numbers, and I think that's a good place to start on this issue. So at the end of the weekend, France had managed to vaccinate just 516 people out of a population, of course, of 67 million. So that's not great. And when you compare it to the other EU countries who have therefore had the vaccines available for the same amount of time, France is also looking pretty bad. So Germany has managed to vaccinate 265,000 people, Italy over 100,000 people, Spain over 80,000 people. And then, of course, outside the EU now, we in the UK have done just over 1 million. So in terms of the raw numbers, it's really not looking good. In Macron's traditional New Year message, he made a commitment to say, we will not allow this to be slow. You know, we'll get going with it. And so far, that's not happened. So he's facing a huge amount of criticism. The French government, planning to accelerate that a lot in the coming weeks. There's going to be hundreds of vaccine centres opened across the country, but whether France can actually fulfill that promise is yet to be seen. So in terms of the raw numbers, French people are going to wait a long time until they get their vaccine.
And it's not, one of the things that I was reading was that there's more procedure in getting the vaccine in France, and there's also more kind of cultural vaccine hesitancy. But from listening to you though, that's not what's causing the problem so far.
Well, I think you're right that those are two massive factors. So part of the reason was perhaps the policy initially. So France had a very restrictive policy as to who was going to get the vaccine in the first place. So it's only going to be care home workers and care home residents. They have since expanded that. So from yesterday, it's been also given to people over 70, medical staff, firefighters. So that's being expanded. But you're right that two big issues are bureaucracy and anti-vaccine sentiment. The system in France is heavily centralized, and there's a lot of paperwork. So doctors have to go through a 45-page protocol where they explain to every single vaccine recipient about the implications of the vaccine. So that's one thing. And doctors have been complaining a lot about the paperwork it takes to get going. And the other thing is anti-vaccine sentiment. France has some of the worst, I guess that's, in my view, that's a bad thing. Some of the worst skepticism towards vaccines in Europe. A poll published in November by Ipsos showed that just 38% of French people would take a vaccine in the next 3 months, even if it was proved effective. So that's the worst in Europe. And that's quite a big challenge to overcome.
It's so interesting. I have the same question that Yasmin Abdul-Majid has, which is why, what's going on with the French? And I don't know, I saw Megan Kenyon. I don't know whether Megan, you're there and you've got your mic on or your camera on. You were just saying that you've done some looking at vaccine hesitancy. I love the fact we've got such a fancy name for it. But Megan, are you there?
Yeah, hi.
Hi there. So what did you find?
I just was doing some research on young women and vaccine hesitancy, because I don't know whether anyone has seen, but there's been a campaign going around on Facebook that's been saying that the Pfizer vaccine, and it's saying it falsely, but that the Pfizer vaccine affects women's fertility. And so that led me on to researching about the HPV vaccine. And there was a campaign in France which was very anti that vaccine. And yeah, it just led me on to this finding that France is like the most skeptical country in the world when it comes to vaccines, which I thought was, I didn't find out why it was France in particular, but it's quite shocking really. But yeah.
We should, well, Megan, that's really interesting. I didn't know about that fertility scare story that's going on. I see my colleague Liz Mosley is nodding away, and a bunch of others. So that's, we did that look at the infodemic, and it might be something. I don't know whether Kim is on today, but we might want to come back to that. We'll definitely look at that. Listen, while we're sort of in this area, I wanted to touch on one other thing, which I suppose takes us back into the UK a little, and that is, before we get to Johnson and sort of the politics of all of this, the big question around testing, because one of the elements, I suppose, of this is that we are in one form or other still going to be reliant on testing. And I'm very unclear why we think we can in any form rely on these lateral flow tests, given what's happened in Liverpool. And Giles, we'll tell you there, I know you've been our sort of testing Mandarin. So do you think there is any argument for using them at all?
Yes, absolutely.
Why?
I'm sure you read Rachel Sylvester in the Times, so did I. Clearly, there is an argument, and the BMJ has been pushing it strongly, that they are not sensitive enough to be useful, especially when used by thee and me. These are lateral flow tests, look like pregnancy tests. As I understand it, the lateral flow that they refer to, by the way, is the flow of the saliva or whatever you put into it, whatever bodily fluid you put into it, across the window to the point where it changes color and tells you there's a result. correct me if I'm wrong there. I may be wrong. But anyway, they're cheap, readily available. They look like pregnancy tests. And you get much more accurate results when performed by nurses, or better still, Port and Down scientists. They get the best results, though they are aimed, like pregnancy tests, at ordinary people. The argument which Rachel Sylvester makes very cogently in today's times against their use is that if when used by the general public, the sensitivity rate is down around 50 or 60%, that means that 50 or 60% of those with COVID, asymptomatic COVID, are told they don't have it, and they go back home or back into school and they infect more people. But the argument in favor is coming back to the fact that they're cheap and readily available. And if you compartmentalize, park for a moment the question of the danger of false negatives, and think about the alternative to an actual, accurate, positive identification of an asymptomatic case. The alternative is you don't catch it. And as Sir John Bell from Oxford puts it, every case of that kind caught is a win. It's not perfect, but let's not let the great be the enemy of the good. Bell calls it a good central defense. It was used.
But hold on a second. The issue is, I understand the argument, Charles, which is, okay, listen, if it can identify more asymptomatic positives, great, right? But my worry is Phoebe Davis in the chat, because this happened in our family too, where one person gets a false negative, right, and then takes comfort from that in the way in which they behave, and in, you know, Phoebe said she had a couple and that they were in both cases negative, and that gave her reassurance. I think this is really significant. Once you get into schools, when you get really high levels of mixing, you know, this doesn't provide security, and the catching the odd asymptomatic positive at the expense of providing a reassurance to people who have the virus but then told that they're negative, the impact on their behavior is real. The way they'll interact, the way they'll approach people, and I just cannot understand. I can't understand how we think that's a risk worth taking.
Well, I think from a public health perspective, it is advocated on the basis very much of the herd, not the individual. People point to particular uses. For example, in Slovakia, 3.6 million people tested, and the infection rate falls by between 60 and 70%, they think. Now, this is partly because they are more sensitive, and you're more likely to get an accurate result if the individual has a very high viral load and therefore is very infectious. The flip side of that coin, as you say, is that asymptomatic people, low viral load, more likely to have a false negative, more likely to go back with false reassurance. And as you say, it has a real effect on the behavior, a real effect on families. I'm no public health expert, but the more persuasive arguments in favor of their use all seem to be as part of an arsenal. I mean, for God's sake, get your actual PCR testing up and running, so that you're not only doing that on a mass scale too, but getting results within a day, as Bill Gates constantly reminds us that you need to do. But just the final thing that always gets my goat is the reason this is so infectious is that you can infect when asymptomatic. So you have to find a way to broadly, roughly, broad brushstrokes, map the spread of the disease. And if there's a tool that is useful in that, in conjunction with much more accurate PCR testing, then I wouldn't rule it out. Also, of course, people are continually coming up with new types of lateral flow test, which they claim are more sensitive, more accurate.
By the way, as you're speaking, Charles, I'm also learning a lot in the chat. I mean, I appreciate Claire Montague's point, which is that it can alleviate some of the pressure on the PCR tests and the slowdown in labs there. I see there's the false positives point. I still don't know what you do about the false negatives, people thinking they're in the clear and behaving differently. But I take Lucy Huberman's point that it's part of a range of measures. The thing that I think we're going to underestimate in this is, for lots of people, getting a clear test means the ability to go to work, do things that they may well want to do. So seeking a system where you're quite likely to get a free pass, even if you've got the illness, is I think has got some risks in it. But I suppose Tess's kind of final sort of test and test again, the kind of WHO mantra from March remains the one here. Listen, I'm going to. But by the way, one thing I did want to just pick up is Sasha Mills. Are you still there, Sasha? Because you just made a point about testing in universities and how.
Yeah.
There you are. You there, Sasha? Can you just explain just what your experience was of that? Because I hadn't. I probably should have heard what you described, but I hadn't.
Yeah, I mean, specifically with lateral flow tests, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, or just testing programs at universities, because I imagine there'll be quite a read across from that into schools.
Yeah, so I guess starting with lateral flow tests, as the government put forward, all students were offered 2 tests at the end of term. The key word there is offered. There wasn't any enforcement around people taking them. And I think the issue with that is that because of, and I can't speak for everyone's living situation, but at my university, you're kept in halls basically for the whole of your degree. So I was in halls, even though I'm second year. People were so afraid of getting stuck at university, especially national students, that people were actually increasingly reluctant to take these tests. On top of that, it was quite a complicated system. You had to be very organized in order to get home in time. We were given training sessions, but they seemed very disorganized. The tests are quite hard to administer, and they basically assume that you will not lie. If you upload your result, you're responsible for putting in your result into a system. They don't check anything. And you would think that nobody would lie, but I know people that were seriously considering it. So yeah, I think a lot of these problems are perhaps more emblematic of the situation within universities, which is one that is increasingly bad. But the testing, there were lots of people that didn't get tested, effectively, to summarize, just in general, even during term, through PCR as well.
And actually, Sasha, as you were speaking, I was seeing that sort of Daniel was reminding us of the moonshot, right? Do you remember the moonshot of sort of mass testing for millions of people every day? Giles, where are we on that particular moonshot? Is that no longer part of government strategy? Or I don't know, Chris, do you know the answer to that? What is the answer to what we're trying to do there?
Chris probably does know more about it. It seems to me that it's been quietly dropped. There was a Liverpool trial which did have an effect in lowering transmission and lowering case numbers. I think the problem with the moonshot is they did it on the cheap and used only lateral flow tests. I mean, and the results weren't persuasive enough. So there were some really tough to digest findings. So that, for example, the Department of Education said, we think these tests, the ones used in Liverpool, were 70% accurate. University of Birmingham, 40%. I think it's instructive to look at environments in which testing has to work. Just one brief example that I'm aware of on film sets, where they are still making films and TV series, and everybody has to keep working. They're tested every day, but the test is a PCR test, so they know. And
Chris, can I just come back to you? I don't understand, sorry, why you think the moonshot doesn't make sense if you've got a vaccination program. In that, just looking at everyone on this screen, I mean, the majority of people on the screen won't have been vaccinated by April, and many won't have been vaccinated by September.
So if you remember it, there are two things really. The first is the moonshot has massive problems. The first of which is it costs an unbelievable amount of money. You know, a second health service sort of levels of spending, and it's at a of a scale that makes sense and can plausibly be justified if you think it's going to let you lock down sooner, right? Because if it allows you to basically do what we hoped test and trace would do originally and sort of reopen everything. The thing is though, if you get to a situation where we're in a sort of sprint now to get the vulnerable people who might get sick from COVID vaccinated, we are talking about we don't really need a long-term strategy, which is what the moonshot really is. We need like a sprint strategy for getting through the next 3 months. Once we get through the next 3 months, all of a sudden everything is different, right? Once you've got the over 60s particularly vaccinated, then the harm of the disease is fundamentally different. And we can basically, the justification for spending 100 billion quid, say, to avoid the genuine and serious complications of, say, long COVID for younger people are much harder to justify.
Right. Okay.
That's a mitigation strategy, you know.
Yeah. I suspect we're going to come back to testing, that we're going to need more of it than we think, and the vaccines are not going to. Well, anyway, we'll see. Kerry, before I wanted to do a bit of the UK, where are we after 8 o'clock last night? I don't know whether you wanted to pick up on this vaccines and testing point, but also broadly, what you think of the manner of the announcement. I was going to get a read from Matt too, if possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Chris's last point there, that I've always thought that once we have vaccinated the vulnerable populations, that actually, it'll be impossible to restrain people who don't feel as immediately threatened by the virus from re-engaging in normal life anyway. But B, as Chris says, I think the argument tends to just weakens dramatically. So in that sense, you know, the vaccine might be more like for a time, might be more like a winter flu vaccine than it is like a vaccine that's trying to achieve herd immunity. But we'll, you know, and so I think, you know, for me, no disaster if, as long as we get, you know, over 60s done by, you know, in reasonably short order, then I think that would be significant enough to take some comfort from. I watched Boris Johnson last night. I thought it was his best yet. I thought he'd learnt from some of the feedback to previous horror shows, that he started with a clear laying out of the facts. So plenty of sort of, he took control of the situation. He didn't try to hand off to a scientist with a graph immediately as he did before Christmas. He laid things out very clearly. He didn't use any of his ridiculous flourishes of language, and I thought in the round probably it was about as close to getting the tone right as I've seen him manage.
Yeah, I thought so too. I thought it was a really interesting thing, which was, if you remember that May 10th announcement where there was the banging of the table and there was a bringing of a certain amount of gusto, someone had said to him, keep your hands on the table, read the auto cue, don't say anything that's not in the auto cue, and say it all absolutely level and without any cheeky chappy glances to the side.
No bugles, no.
There was a twitch of one, but almost you could manage to get through it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just astonishing that it's taken this long to get that sorted, because, you know, here we are, you know, 10 or 11 months into this thing, and finally I think he's understood some really simple communication messages, but I thought he got there.
Yeah, interesting. Matt, I'm sure others are going to have views on this, and I'm going to come to you in a second. I am Matt, I'm going to ask you, and I'm also going to just play in, have you seen Katie's point, asking whether or not the February half term is just a way of sugaring the pill, that it's going to take us, you know, into March, probably April?
Well, I think that the reason that they framed it around education is because, just to scroll back a bit, because as you know, I've been looking into this. Last night's statement is represented the culmination of a story that began on December the 30th, which was the day that Brexit was voted through Parliament. So that got off the out of the door, and AstraZeneca was approved. So suddenly then you had Brexit out the way, and AstraZeneca, which was always going to be the main manufacturer of vaccines for this country, as a possible supplier, as of now. Simultaneous to that, you had the new variant, and since then, the so-called Kentish or UK variant, and since then the South African variant, which is in private, deeply worrying the Oxford team. Now, why frame it in terms of half terms? Precisely because in terms of life, most people's lived experience, homeschooling, the problems of having kids in often cramped conditions at home, wondering about their futures, was the thing that generated at least the most vocal problems last time round. And therefore to say by the end of February half term made sense. There was a lot of resistance from Williamson and others about closing schools at all outside the tiering system. So that took a lot of, it really took the spiking getting to the point where it was impossible to argue otherwise. So you had the rather absurd thing of the Prime Minister on Sunday saying no fewer than 6 times schools are safe, which at that point was the position, and people duly, where they were allowed to, sending their kids to school on Monday, and no longer allowed to after his announcement last night, which was, in terms of comms, a very poor start to this strategy. The other thing to say about it is it's a pincer strategy. It's lockdown compliance. People have to comply with the lockdown, and we know that their inclination to do so has declined since the March lockdown. That's part one. And part two is the vaccine rollout working, which is fantastically tightly geared in that it is possible to get out 2 million doses a week, possible, but it involves, it's like a kind of Jenga. Everything has to be in the right position. And to get through those, sorry, go on, James.
No, I just wanted to ask you about that, Matt, because it seems like the pattern of our experience around these announcements is somewhere between 15 minutes and 3 days later, we wake up and go, oh no, they've done it again. Yeah. They've bought into the scientific evidence, but X weeks too late, and they've allowed optimism bias to get the better of them. Yes. In this case, it does seem clear that scientific advice. Yeah, sorry, go on, Matt.
Well, the most worrying section of the speech, I think, was Johnson changing the definition of what a vaccinated person is, from someone who has received 2 doses of either vaccine, AstraZeneca or Pfizer, to someone who has been offered one of them. That's a very different definition of a vaccinated person. So one needs to watch that very carefully. If you're trying to get to that 14 million that covers the top 4 vulnerable groups, there's a big difference between an 85-year-old woman with diabetes who's had 2 doses of the AZ vaccine and an 85-year-old woman who's received a text from her local GP offering her an appointment on her smartphone, which she can't use.
Matt, that is well observed, but not, if not very encouraging. Sorry about that. Can I talk about one thing, which is the point that is happening in the conversation between Katie and Gurjinder around whether or not there is a strategy behind the middle of February lockdown, i.e. they actually know, or the scientific advice suggests, it goes beyond it takes kids out of school for the whole of this term. They just don't want to say it yet because they're worried about people's stamina. And so say it, get us to the halfway point and then say, we're not quite there yet, but we will be by the end of term.
Yes, and it was interesting. I agree with that, because not least because Gove there's already been slippage of the language on that from Gove talking about March. So I think this is a secondary consideration when you're talking about something as behavioural and sociological as this. But I think Parliament will have problems with anything that goes beyond initially February half term. And I think that Johnson doesn't want at the moment to be spending his time arguing with, however, the latest research group, whether it's coronavirus or the European research group or the China research group. He needs Parliament to be at least acquiescing. So it's a way of handling Parliament. But I think it would be, I'd personally be very surprised if children go back to school after February half term.
Okay. Well, Matt, well, two things to say thank you. That's really interesting. The other is I had a really good conversation with our colleague Pete Hoskin this morning, who, when he called me at the start of the day, said, you know, I'm feeling really quite upbeat about this year, day 2 of our first working week. I think you've done for that. So thank you very much. That was pretty comprehensive. So thank you, Matt. I know there were some things that were happening in the chat we didn't get to. I saw that I think it's Andrew Bestbeer who made the point about, could we have a Slack group, notwithstanding Slack's own problems this past week, but a Slack group, which we'll look into, I'll pick up. And there's a really interesting point that I'm sorry we didn't get even close to, which I saw that Tom Dunn made the point around the 3 million self-employed excluded from financial support by the Chancellor's support packages. We covered that, obviously discussed it quite at length at the COVID inquiry. His point in the chat, which is this has become a deliberate point of policy rather than an oversight. We will come back to that and take another look at it. I appreciate that there is a really lively and meaty conversation in the chat. I'm going to just make a copy of it and go back and look over it all. But just to say thank you everyone for joining us for this, our first open news meeting of the year. Let me or Ella know if there are other thoughts that you think haven't been covered. I'm James at tortoisemedia.com and Ella's Ella at tortoisemedia.com. So do drop us a line. But just to say thank you very much. Welcome back to the world we're in. Have a good afternoon.